and you have to kind of question, like, if you do have a low, like how much of this is mental versus me just not being able to physically go faster than this. And I think the more times you're able to push through those perceived walls mentally, the more prepared you are to realize how hard it is to actually like optimally execute a 100-mile race.
Running 100 miles seems impossible, and maybe even kind of crazy. And it is, but we believe in big crazy dreams. That's why we ran 100 miles. It was such a life-changing experience for us, we decided to devote this podcast to preparing and inspiring you to run your first ultra race.
Are you ready to feel the highest highs and the lowest lows? Are you ready to do what you once thought was impossible? Are you ready for your trail to 100? Thank you for joining us here on Trail to 100, the podcast made to help you finish your first 100-mile race. My name is Jacob Bateman, and joined along with me is my beautiful and lovely wife, Melody. And as our special guest, guys, we have one of the best in the world. We have Zach Bitter. Now, Zach has held multiple world records for the 100-mile distance. He currently holds the 100-mile trail record at 12 hours and 8 minutes and 36 seconds. Now, he doesn't hold these records anymore, but he's held records in the 100-mile track record, the 12-hour track record, and the 100-mile treadmill record at one point. So this man knows the 100-mile distance, and that's right. We brought him on for one of our Pillars of Ultra Running episode, and today we're going to be talking about mindset. Now, Zach, he ran in high school and in Division III college, but he wasn't exactly your top of the team, not even the best on his own team. He competed, but he wasn't the best. So running these long distances and winning these races actually came later in life rather than earlier. And he talks about the mindset that it took for him to develop to become one of the best in the world. And he gives a lot of great advice, guys, just on the mindset and the strategies that you can implement to have that right mindset on race day so that you can be ready to crush your first 100-mile race. You're not going to want to miss this one, guys. So let's get to it. Well, Zach, thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast today. We are excited to talk about your beginning ultra days / the mindset it takes to run 100 miles.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's always fun to chat 100 miles, and, the mind is a big piece to that puzzle, so I'm happy to discuss.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it feels like it's like 99% of the puzzle sometimes. Let's go back. Let's rewind. We know you have some really awesome accomplishments, specifically in the 100-mile distance, but we want to hear about, first off, what drew you to the 100-mile distance and what started you down that journey to where you had that drive and desire to want to run that 100 miles?
Yeah, it was a long journey, I would say. I started getting interested in running at a very young age, relatively speaking. I was in middle school and sort of learned at that age that there was a difference between different sports and your ability to do well at them. And it wasn't just like, oh, some people are good at sports, some people aren't. And it became kind of clear to me that like the one that I was probably best at just naturally was running, and specifically distance running. So at that point, at that young age, it just probably funneled me a little more towards what would have been relatively long to what was offering at like things like track and field day, and then eventually track and cross country in high school and things like that. So I also had like a pretty gradual path through that too, because I recognized that running was maybe a strength of mine, it didn't necessarily deter me from wanting to do other sports. I stayed pretty like involved with that stuff and excited about all of it. So I played most of the sports available to me up through most of high school, and then even to some degree in college from like intramurals and things like that. So running in terms of taking it seriously enough to where I was making, I would say, like considerable sacrifices for that sport, where it's like, yeah, maybe I shouldn't play a game of pickup basketball because if I land wrong and roll my ankle, it's going to have a consequence on the track race or the cross country race. Wasn't probably until college. So at that point, I was very interested in learning more about running. And I think my high school coach kind of put me in a position to recognize that I had some potential. And then my college coach put me in a position to really kind of learn about the sport and kind of figure out like why are we doing what we're doing versus just kind of showing up for practice and accepting that on Tuesdays we do intervals, Thursdays a tempo run, Sundays long run, meet Saturday, that sort of kind of a traditional track or cross country type of programming. So while kind of going through all of that, I started also kind of thinking about, I mean, in college I was a Division III runner and I wasn't even great relative to like my teammates. So I had no aspirations of turning it into a profession of any sort. So my biggest thought was, is this a passion that I am interested enough in that I'm going to like carve out the time to do outside of whatever career path I end up taking? And at the time, the answer was very much yes. I was very motivated to, do it for the sake of doing it, so to speak. And that led me into just kind of trying to understand what it was I liked about the sport and try to appreciate like the opportunity cost there of, if I'm doing this thing for essentially enjoyment or self-fulfillment, what areas of the sport do I actually enjoy more than others, and where's that application in terms of balancing out things like competing at events versus just going out and doing what I want to do with that time I have. So that process led me to kind of just recognizing that the long run was my favorite piece to the puzzle. So after college, I started sort of shifting a lot of my training towards just doing a lot more volume and not a lot of any speed work for a while. I think after college I did, for about a year at least, I think I did very little speed work outside of maybe some impromptu stuff where you just happen to feel good and push a little harder. Some of it was just for reasons I said, I was kind of more interested in just the act of running and building volume up versus doing the structured speed work. The other part of it was I was probably just a little burnt out from speed work from the whole track and cross country programs that you see at the collegiate level. So that kind of put me in a position I would sign up for marathons, but they were sort of, in hindsight, I look at them as like kind of like ill-prepared marathons, more or less. And then I did do some where I did have a lot more structure, where I did start bringing speed work back. I think maybe once I got far enough removed from college that I hadn't done any real structured speed work at the capacity I was in college, I started recognizing that you do sort of lose those benefits over time and they can be useful. So I started kind of reintroducing that to some degree. And more or less just kind of like building my interest in running without the structure of a team there. So not having a coach and teammates to run with. It's like, what am I doing and how am I structuring this to still get the same experience that I was looking for before? And that led me to longer events and things like that. And then one summer, as I was sort of looking at just what was available, I think I was looking for a marathon. And I was living in Wisconsin at the time. And while I was going through the list of events that fall, I came across this 50 miler. And I was like, totally unaware there were even 50 milers in the state of Wisconsin. I was aware of ultramarathons. I had read Dean Karnas's book, which was, I think, one of the early like ultramarathon books that kind of hit more or less like kind of the greater running world or the public reading list of stuff that could potentially show up, and was aware of it and thought that's interesting. Maybe that's something I'd like to do. But in my mind, I was like, that's what someone does when they have more or less exhausted running the shorter distances and no longer have interest or desire to try to improve those. So I think at one point I even said, like, when I'm 30, maybe I'll run an ultra marathon. I was like, I was in my early 20s at the time. So okay. I saw that 50 miler and I was like, man, that's like less than an hour and a half or something like that from where I was living. And there weren't a lot of other compelling options on the list of the marathon distance. So I thought, you know what, maybe I'll just do this, see what it's like. And then, probably won't enjoy it enough to make that my priority. And then I'll come back to it around when I'm 30, 6-7 years later. So I trained for that race. And I actually did a fairly thorough buildup for that one. I did speed workout. I would say my order of operations was probably off in hindsight in terms of kind of when I did the speed work relative to like building out long runs and things like that. Generally speaking, if you just look at it from a global endurance fitness standpoint, I was probably in a pretty good spot. So I actually had a really good time at that race. I won it. I went through like all the emotions you'd expect from a 50-mile race for the first time where, once I got past 30 miles, I had gone further than I ever had before. So there's this unknown. I think I remember like I hit mile like 42. There was like what was probably an incredibly small hill that looked like an absolute Mount Everest in my mind. So I was just like cursing the race director's name. Why would you put this at 42 miles? And, that whole that whole routine.
Yes.
But fortunately, I didn't make enough mistakes early on to have like a really negative experience. And for me, from my prior experience, I was good enough to get to kind of the big meets, relatively speaking. Like in high school, I made my state track and cross country, but I was not on the podium. In college, I made the varsity track and cross country team, and I was probably good enough to make the conference team. But then at the conference meet, I was going to be an afterthought, and I certainly wasn't going on to nationals. So like in terms of like winning races that I was targeting, it was a little bit of a different experience, because to that point, it was more about sort of self-improvement within whatever goals I have set for myself, versus like having the secondary goal of obviously fulfilling your own self-improvement goals and things like that, but also maybe winning the race. So that sort of got me interested in it to some degree too. And just like the whole experience was fun. I like the idea of kind of the primary intensity, or I shouldn't say primary intensity, but the intensity at which I was going to race being the intensity I was the most interested in training. So I ended up I did take a full year off from running ultras after that, but then at that same race the following year in 2011, I did that race and 2 other 50 milers in like a 9-week period of time. And then I was hooked. 2012 onward, I was doing nothing but ultra marathons. And I know your podcast is kind of 100-mile based, so I've got a fun story with that. In 2012, I did the Ice Age 50 mile, which at the time was one of the golden ticket races to race into Western states. They weren't called golden ticket races back then. I think they were like the Montreal Ultra Cup races or something like that.
Okay.
Same general framework though. You finish in the top, I think it was still top 2. It was either top 2 or top 3 gets you in. And I went into that race as that being my target race. I knew I wanted to run 100 milers at one point, and I had in the back of my mind thinking that's probably going to be the distance that I eventually focus on. But I also still kind of had a little bit of that mindset of like, that's down the road. I'm interested in 50 milers right now. So my mindset was do what I can at the Ice Age 50 mile. And if I get into Western states, I wasn't even planning on accepting it. So did the race. I won it. I think I even told the person who's first man out he should expect to be able to go to Western states, and then like immediately found after that I'd be a complete idiot if I passed on a spot at Western states.
You wouldn't take it?
Right. I know it sounds absurd now. I mean, back then it was a little easier to get into Western states, but you were still looking at a framework of if you wanted to get into the lottery, there's a chance it was going to be 6 years. So you shouldn't take it for granted either way.
Yeah.
Now it's like you enter the lottery as a first year ticket holder, you're looking at less than a 1% chance. And I think you may be looking at a 10-year process. So like in hindsight, I'm like very glad I picked that. In terms of it being my first 100-miler, that was a bit of an eye-opening experience. I was a kid who learned to run and had lived in the Midwest my whole life. So mountains were a bit of a foreign concept for me in terms of where I would race. So I had the opportunity to run my first 100-miler. Not only, well, I guess anytime it's your first 100 miles, the furthest you've gone, but it was also in an environment that was completely different from what I've ever done before. So fortunately for me, I was a school teacher at the time, so I did have summer vacation where I had 12 weeks of a lot of freedom, and I was on a bit of a tight timeline because Ice Age is in May, I think mid-May. So you get the golden ticket at Ice Age, you're looking at a very short timeline between that and Western states, like 5 or 6 weeks. So you sort of take that ticket and hope for the best in terms of where your fitness is at, unless you were anticipating getting in and structuring things that way. So what I ended up doing that year is as soon as school, I got really lucky that year actually, because school in Wisconsin usually got out in like kind of mid-June, like the second week in June. So like the 10th, 11th, 12th, usually around that time frame. For whatever reason that year, things were skewed differently, and the last day of school was May 31st. So I had a little bit more of I had an early start to summer. So I actually like got in my car and drove out to California around maybe 2 weeks before the race and got to go on. I got on about 70 miles of the course, I think, in the days leading into the race. So not the days leading in, but I think the weekend, I did cut it kind of close. I think I did like a 30-mile run out in the high country on like the weekend before Western states. So thankfully I was still young and resilient enough where that was probably absorbable. But it was eye-opening. I mean, I remember one of those training runs, I was like told that, okay, the course markers are up already. Just follow those and that'll lead you to the spot where we'll pick you up. And I got lost inevitably and found myself just like out there somewhere unknown to me where I was. I eventually ended up at like a fire road somewhere that I'm like, okay, this has to go somewhere. And it was getting late enough in the day where I was starting to think like, man, if I don't find somebody, I'm going to be up here with the bears and everything else tonight. So I just bombed down this fire road and I eventually end up in this like RV park. And I didn't even remember exactly the name of the place I was supposed to get picked up. So I walk into this RV park and there's like 2 or 3 people camping there. And I went over to there's this couple that was like sitting outside their RV. They had like their truck hooked up to it and everything. And I just asked them, I'm like, hey, I'm on the Western States course and I'm supposed to be picked up somewhere. Like it's supposed to be some sort of a recognizable spot. I think I knew like half the name of it or something. And this guy just happened to be one of the aid station volunteers, or like I think he was maybe even one of the captains, if I remember right, of like of an aid station. So he was very aware of Western States. And as soon as I said like whatever like completely like incorrect version of where I was supposed to get picked up, he recognized where I intended. He's like, oh, I know where that is. It's like 15 miles away. So he unhooked his truck from the RV and drove me there.
That's so nice.
And I eventually found my way back. So I guess at that point I was probably prepared to navigate the 100 milers since I had already had enough adventure. I had some adventure leading into it, but it was a total blast. I was definitely outside my realm of expertise at the time, but I had a lot of fun. I enjoyed it enough. I had all the highs and lows you'd expect for a 100 miler in your first one. A lot of kindness from strangers, and got myself to the finish line. I think I ran 16:52 or 53 or something like that, and it was like 13th or 14th place, something like that. So
Awesome.
I was excited to get into some 100 milers after that. That was kind of my introduction.
Wow. I love that your first 100 was Western States.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
So how much, I'm always curious about this, looking back, like with that first 100 compared to, the first 50, the first couple 50s, what was the big difference between running 50 miles and 100 miles and what you had to adjust there? And what surprised you, or, just what was the difference there?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest differences for me was you have this you're going to go through some highs and lows even with 50 milers, especially if you're sort of like right on edge of where your capabilities are, but you're not closing a gap quite as large. So like for me, like running 30 miles and then extending that to 50, that gap of 20 miles, there was probably, as I found out at mile 42 with that tiny little hill that looked like a mountain, that was a low point, but it was like a low point that was in relative close proximity to the finish line. So in my mind's eye, it was like, all right, I mean, even if this really is terrible and doesn't get better, it's only 8 miles, versus if that happens to you at mile 42 of a 100 mile, it's like wrapping your head around 58 more miles at that low is going to be a very, very tough mental battle to get over. So I think really what it comes down to is things like pacing, things like your nutrition and your hydration, and just your reason for being out there is going to be a little more important when you get to that longer distance, because as the intensity gets lower for these events, the advantage is that you can process things, which is nice in some degree. You can think about things, and it's not just like everything's flying by so fast you don't have a chance to even consider things. So that can be good, but can also be bad in the sense like if you make a mistake or if things get bad, you have all these opportunities to fixate on it. So eventually you have to kind of like crowd that out and work on crowding that out versus having like the intensity of the race itself somewhat do that for you. So like the way I describe it is like if you do a 5K, that's so fast from an endurance standpoint that if you make a mistake, you don't even know you made that mistake until the end of the race and it's over, and you kind of have to process it afterwards and figure out what did I do wrong and why did I do it. Versus a 100 mile, you make a mistake, you might be thinking about that for hours and hours, and then if it gets bad enough, you may drop out. So I think just learning like how to manage the highs and lows properly, because you have to like almost fight this intuition where when things get really bad at a point or bad at all, they will get better. But when things get really, really good, you can't necessarily lean into those too heavily, because if you do, you may be far enough from the finish line where you overextend yourself for a while and then you find yourself in a bigger hole later. So specifically at Western States that year, I remember I didn't have any caffeine until mile 88. And I think it was just like some version of like a 5-hour energy. So like 200 milligrams of caffeine after not having it all day. And it hit me like really hard. And I was just like off to the races. I remember I told my pacer, Gary Gellin at the time, who was familiar with the area, we're 12 miles from the finish. I'm like, let's go, let's do this. Let's see if we can break a record from segment to segment on the course or something like that. And then by mile 95, it had worn off. And I was just like, just miserable. So like that last 5 miles of the race was a tough finish for me. Thankfully, I was close at that point, so I could get to it. And the interesting thing I think about the mindset of a 100 miler for the first time versus the second time is there is a little bit of ignorance being bliss. So like I went into that race thinking like I hadn't dropped out of any ultra marathons at that point, and in my mind it wasn't really a question of finishing, it was a question of how quick I could get to the finish line. So however dumb that assumption was, it was just something I didn't really give a lot of thought. So I think in the moment I didn't even entertain that as an option at any point. So when I was hitting spots that I was like, all right, things aren't going the way I want them to right now, it's tough. The concept of arriving at the next aid station and pulling out was just not an option I'd given myself. So if I would have like hurt myself out there, maybe I would have had a different thought, or that thought would enter my mind. But thankfully, things from that side went smoothly. So I eventually arrived at Auburn High School with my first 100-mile finish, and not too much worse for the wear.
I think that's so true, that ignorance is bliss. Jacob and I, we've only done a few 100s, and we've noticed that each 100 is scarier than the last one. We think it'd be the opposite, but now you know what you're getting yourself into, and it's 10 times scarier.
Yeah. Another interesting thing I find about the 100-mile distance is if you do a few of them like you have, what ends up happening sometimes is you sort of get to these sticking points where it's like, this part just seems to always be a little bit of a struggle. And then eventually you find a part where you sort of solve that part of the puzzle and you're able to push a little harder. But all you really do with that is make the entire process next time a little more difficult, because now you've confirmed in your mind you're able to be strong at that point. So now that becomes the expectation. So now you have like an increased expectation for yourself, which just makes it a little bit more difficult. And you have to kind of question, like, if you do have a low, like how much of this is mental versus me just not being able to physically go faster than this. And I think the more times you're able to push through those perceived walls mentally, the more prepared you are to realize how hard it is to actually like optimally execute a 100-mile race.
That is so relatable, because as you say that, I just ran 100 miles a couple weeks ago, and it's probably the roughest race I've had at that distance. And I think one of the mistakes I made is because things went south sooner than it had the past couple times. And I kept thinking back to my previous two races where I'm like, I wasn't feeling like this at this point yet, and I kept comparing, like, why am I struggling more at this point than last time? And mentally that really started to wear on me as I just kept looking back at previous races and wondering why in this race at this moment I'm feeling so much worse than the past race. So Zach, with that 100-mile distance and fighting off like the lows and the roller coasters, we wanted to talk a lot about mindset today. When preparing for a 100-mile race, how do you prepare to go through those lows?
Yeah, I love this question, because this is one of the, if I had to list things that if I knew this from the beginning to now, what would if I had to pick that like information to send my prior self, this would be one of the things I would have sent myself right out the gate, because I think it's like a really valuable tool. So like, I don't think people have to really give it too much thought to realize that these things are a big mental hurdle, and like mental strength and determination and things like that are going to be things that they need to be thinking about. But then the process of actually putting that into place, or how do you actually practice that, is kind of the next step to that. And when I first got into ultra running, I very much looked at training through the physical lens, in the sense that I'm doing this workout for some physical advantage by like maybe I'm doing short intervals earlier in the plan to improve my overall fitness, so that when I do get around to maximizing my long run or develop my long run, I'm doing it from a higher potential. And I didn't really think of it that much further than that. In fact, I thought probably short intervals are like kind of a means to an end. They're like something that is useful, but not necessarily something that I really have any other purpose to do them for. Whereas now when I do a short interval session, one thing that kind of trends with them is inevitably I'll get about a third of the way into the thing and start questioning whether I should do the number of intervals I set out to do. So let's say it's 10 and I get to 3. I'm thinking, you know what, maybe 10 is too much. The rule is you should be able to do 1 or 2 extra when you finish. That's the right dosage. Maybe 8 is that number. I think 8's probably that number, not 10. And I have to kind of back myself up at that point and remind myself, I'm at 3 right now. We shouldn't be worrying about where I end in terms of having 1 or 2 intervals left in the tank. until I get to the point where one or two intervals are left in the tank. So then it's like it's backing things up, or like what I like to call is like zooming in and zooming out at the right times. And this is an opportunity where like you want to zoom in because you're starting interval number 4. There's really no good reason to think about intervals 9 and 10 at that point. That's the time where you should be thinking about executing interval 4 properly and not really thinking past that, because you should know, kind of relatively speaking, based on prior training, what's an appropriate pacing and intensity for the specific interval. So then if you do that, then you don't really need to be worried about the other stuff until it comes. So then you finish 4, take your recovery run in between, or jog or walk, whatever it happens to be, hike if you're on the mountains, and then you do your next interval and you take care of that one. And you start to chunk it in a way where you're not really thinking about the grand total. And that translates very well to 100 miling, because you don't really want to be thinking about finishing the 100 miler when you're standing on the starting line or you're at the first aid station. You want to be thinking about running within yourself, so not exceeding drastically what you're capable of to the point where now you're taking time, you're adding time to the end because you're going out too fast and beating yourself up. So doing what you know you need to be doing, but doing it within a small framework or a small obstacle to get to before you start thinking about the next step. I think we do this stuff a lot of times intuitively in our life, but we don't necessarily think about it because it's become second nature. So if you can make that second nature by practicing it in training, that's the win. So like if I have a big project due, let's say like, or actually, no, let's make this very running related. If I'm going to train for a 100 miler and that 100 miler is 20 weeks away, I might sit down and just write out my entire plan of what I would like it to look like and have this like beautiful transcript of how it should go or what it's likely going to look like, or even just a scaffolding of that. At that point, I'm not going to every day get up and look at that whole thing and on week 1 be like, oh my gosh, look at that workout at week 17. How am I ever going to do that? You're just not going to do that. Yeah. You're going to look at the next workout on the page. You're going to do that workout, and then you're going to, move to the next one. You're just going to, one by one, you're going to systematically go through that. And then by the time you get to the starting line, that whole body of work you did is what's going to get you to the finish line. So if you're thinking about everything from that same kind of mindset, I think it gets easier to do that on race day at the 100 miles. And you start recognizing in your day-to-day life, in your workouts, even non-specific workouts like short intervals, how can you actually like practice the mental side of things that you're going to want to try to do intuitively on race day. Because the more I think you can go on cruise control with that thought process, the more mental energy you preserve. So I have this like kind of theory where on race day, you've got like this physical and mental, 2 separate batteries, essentially, your physical battery and your mental battery. And you're going to try to drain both of those at a perfect pace so that at the end you've exhausted them, but you're not using too much of them too early to the point where you run out and have a bad end of the race. So I think people think about the physical energy piece of the puzzle to some degree, and that's pacing. But the mental energy thing I think is just as important, where if I'm out there nonstop thinking about, 100 miles, this is huge, what am I doing, blah, 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 then like I might be burning a ton of mental energy that should just be non-existent. It should just be pretty narrow focused in terms of that next aid station is 6 miles away. How do I chunk that to get to that spot? And I think when you do that, you just put yourself in a position where step by step, you find yourself eventually at that last aid station. And now you can start wrapping your head around finishing, because the next step gets you to the finish line. And you could do this with every part of the process too. And I think when I first recognized this, I actually did it with things more specific to the race, where I'd be doing long runs or even back-to-back long runs, and I would just do this visualization thing where, let's say it was a pretty long run, like 3-4 hours and roughly 30 miles or something like that. And I would just envision like, okay, I'm at mile 70 of the race I'm doing. Let's just visualize that last 30 miles on this long run, and then do that for every long run going into the race itself. So if I start like building out my long run 6-8 weeks out from the race and get it up to that kind of peak distance or close to that peak distance, doing that, half a dozen to a dozen times over the course of that final phase of training, when you get to the race itself, now when you get to that point in the race, it just becomes one more long run on top of the bunch that you have already done, versus it being like something you're doing with 70 miles in your legs. So you can sort of shape all these things in some way to kind of like aid the process in the race, to kind of chunk it in a way that's going to be mentally manageable. And the more mentally manageable you make it, I think the more physically capable you're able to do it. Because at the end of the day, it's long enough that the intensity is low. So what that ends up doing is it ends up putting you in a position where you're just a lot more likely to underestimate how much you probably have left at the end compared to what you actually could given, a good mindset or positive mindset versus a negative one.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
This is so helpful.
I love how you put that into like an interval run with like, being at interval 3 or, sprint number 3 in your run and thinking about 8 and 9, like just recognizing that and being present in the moment, be like, wait a sec, let's not get ahead of ourselves. I know I can run this interval right here. I'm going to get that done and then I'll move on to 4. I think that is golden advice there about training the mind to be present.
So you talk about draining your physical and mental battery and making sure that you're kind of draining them at the same time. I understand how to pace yourself physically, but how do you pace yourself mentally so your mental battery isn't completely wiped out by the middle of your 100?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think this process I think is best is best started during your training. So it's 100 miles, and part of the fun of it, quote unquote fun of it, maybe type 2 fun of it, I should say, is the fact that there are going to be things that are sort of uncontrollable, or if you were to sit down and try to account for everything that's going to happen, you'd get such a long list that you would never be able to actually break it all down and properly probably execute. So there's a limit there. So I think first thing is recognizing that part of this process is going to be staying aware that something is likely going to happen you didn't expect. And when that does happen, having a process in place to sort of move on from that and look at it, it's like, what's the next best alternative now that that's happened versus fixating on it behind you. With that being said, you don't necessarily want to throw caution to the wind either, because if you do that, then you're going to put yourself in a situation where those uncertainties or uncontrollables are going to be things that actually were controllable, and you end up just dealing with those all day long because you weren't prepared, and then you burn yourself out mentally trying to problem solve more often than you need to. So I think the first thing you want to do is be honest with yourself about the things you can control by just like starting with some basic things like being familiar with the race course to the point where are the aid stations, roughly how long is it going to take me from one aid station to the next. In training, actually using your long runs appropriately to be able to kind of gauge things like how much am I going to need from this aid station to the next. So like a lot of courses, you might have an aid station where it's relatively short, where you can get by with just a bottle and maybe like a little bit of nutrition in the pocket, versus like you have another spot where it's hot, it's twice as long, and you might need to have like 2-3 times as much as you did from that next station. So just being aware of that so that you offload some of that mental energy of planning for that by having it all accounted for. So your awareness is that of being able to just kind of go through the checklist versus figuring it out on the fly. So that's a good way to save kind of that, or manage that mental battery to some degree beforehand. And then it's just like, I think this is where I think the mental and the physical sometimes blend too. I think pacing physically plays into like your mental focus to some degree, because if you're going a little too fast, I think that does distract you from being able to actually execute at the end, both physically and mentally. So not only is it too fast, so physically you're more worn out, but if you're more physically worn out at the end, you're going to give yourself a situation where the negative self-talk is much more powerful, and you're going to have to use more mental strength to push past that. So if you pace yourself properly, and I think in most cases for 100 miles, most people are going out too fast. So they find themselves running a pretty big positive split, and because of that, they get in this mindset of the last part of the race, maybe it's 20 miles, maybe it's 30 miles, is going to be by far the most difficult. There's no way around it. I might as well bank some time early, all the kind of classic things that you hear. In reality, it's like if you put yourself in that position, then you're just asking yourself to have to be way more mentally strong in order to do what you wanted, in order to like get there in a subpar way. So I think if you like start out conservatively, what ends up happening is you get to that point in the race where you would normally feel like, okay, it sort of is just hang on for dear life. And that turns into, all right, I'm tired. I can tell I've been out here all day, but I've still got a lot of focus left, and I can focus on moving fast versus holding on for dear life. Mm-hmm. And since a lot of people are going to make that mistake, you also have the added advantage if you put yourself in that position, Now you get all this positive stimulus where you're moving faster than the next person. You're probably passing people, which is going to give you a little bit of a sense of accomplishment, feed that positive energy, and it's going to kind of help keep you heading in the positive direction. So I want to make sure that even though I separate the mental and the physical battery to some degree, I think they also work synergistically with one another. But really, I think doing as much planning as you can, having that kind of outlined in a way that you can execute. One thing I like to do is base that off of aid stations too, to some degree, where like, this is what I like to build it out as a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C. So plan A is going to be like the nutrition and hydration strategy that you love. It's your favorite one. It's the one that you can count on. It's worked a bunch of times for you in the past. It doesn't hardly ever let you down. It's like your best friend out there on the course. Plan B is something else that works well, but it's maybe just not quite as popular for you as plan A. Or for 100-milers, I like to look at it this way. One of those, plan A or plan B, can be like a sports product or an easy to digest, easy thing like liquid gel based kind of calories. So the other one maybe be like a solid food, something that contrasts it. So you have like something that's more sports product based, and then something so that's probably going to be a little more sweet flavored in most cases, liquidy gel based. And the other one might be something as simple as like a cracker or a pretzel. So it's polarizing. It's crunchy, it's salty, a little more savory, different texture so that you don't get palate fatigue and things like that. And having those things tested in training so you know how your body responds to them. And then plan C can just be something where like, I'll probably use this at some point during the day. Things go amazing, maybe I won't, but I should have it in my back pocket just in case I feel it as a motivator, or for whatever reason plan A and plan B aren't working. So that you sort of have this really like ingrained order of operations of things you have available to you, so you don't have to think about that on race day. So that's offloading mental bandwidth to pre-race stuff versus intra-race stuff, so that you can save in-race mental battery in exchange for pre-race mental battery when you have more of it to give. And then I think just from there, knowing where the aid stations are, a good move is like when you're like a mile or a kilometer or so from it, start thinking about what you're going to do with that structure. So when you're getting in there, think to yourself, okay, this aid station is one where I have a little bit of a longer stretch between this one and the next one. So I am really thinking plan A is what I'm really craving right now. So I'm going to make sure I get plan A accounted for in the aid station. I'm going to need an extra 20 ounces of fluid because of the extra duration. So I'm going to make sure that when I go to my drop bag, I grab that extra bottle, put it in my pack. And you're running through that list of what you need to do as you're entering the aid station. That gives you a little bit of a distraction from the running side of things, which I think is good to some degree. If you can distract yourself with some like kind of a little bit of busy work, it kind of it closes some of that time you feel you're out there trying to break the boredom up. But then when you get in the aid station too, you're not just in there just kind of like, oh, maybe that looks good. Oh, maybe I should grab this. And you're thinking through the things while you're standing there. Because I'm sure you can relate, in 100 miles, the clock moves 100 times as fast when you're in the aid station than it does when you're out on the trail.
Yes.
So if you go into the aid station with a plan, get your stuff, and then just start walking out. If you don't have like a reason to sit down and like change your shoes or socks, which are sometimes things you're going to want to do, but in most cases, you can go in there with a process of this is what I need, get it, and start walking out. And then if it's something where it's like, all right, I want to, if someone is like eating and drinking in the aid station, within reason, do that walking out of the aid station. You can likely walk and eat and drink. So start that process while you're covering some ground. And what it likely does better than those like very slow walking steps you take out of the aid station is it keeps you from finding a reason to stay there that you don't need. So as long as you have a list of things that you know is going to have you prepared, so you're not missing things that are necessary by rushing through, you can actually get out sooner, have your stuff, spend a little extra time walking, because this would have been standing still time in the aid station, so it's not really of a consequence in your race plan. And it's always easier to do some of the fueling and hydration when you're walking versus running. So if you can find the opportunities to do that when you're doing those things, I always find that to be just a little bit more of a mental relief, because I'm not like kind of like beating myself because I can't get that package open while I'm trying to run, versus just walking there and opening it quite easily. And just finding these really little things that make the day more convenient, so you use less frustration or negative energy with it, or get more negative energy from it, are just things that you tend to kind of learn as you kind of go through it to some degree, or consider as you're kind of playing through them in training, and just really being mindful when you're doing things like the long runs that are a little bit longer than your average one, so that you have that opportunity to actually be in the position that's similar to what it'll be like on race days, where you can a lot of times find out where some of those things are actually going to sit on race day.
Wow, I think a lot of people, when they think of running, they just think all you do is put on your running shoes and you just run. That's so boring. But there's so much thinking, there's so much mental game that goes into it. And I'm someone who suffers from decision fatigue every single day. I overthink everything. What am I going to wear? What am I going to have for breakfast? I love this idea of limiting the decisions and planning as much as you can so you don't run into decision fatigue during the race. But then, like you said, also accepting that there's some things that you can't control and being prepared to problem solve when those issues arrive. One more question I had on this topic is, do you think having a good crew and having good pacers is a good way to recharge your mental battery? Or maybe they can help offload some of the decision-making things as well?
Yeah, I can. I think this gets a little bit into the personality of the runner to some degree, because I can appreciate some people wanting to avoid some of that. And I've had races where I feel like I did better without crew and pacer, because I was maybe in a situation at the time where it just wasn't optimal for me to really go through the thorough process I would in order to maximize that. And then it would have become a situation where now I'm worrying about the crew and the pacer and their role as well as mine. So like in 2016, I kind of last minute decided to do the Javelina 100 because I had this really unique situation. I had a potential sponsor offering to get back into Western States, believe it or not, but I didn't have a qualifier yet. So like they don't care if you have a sponsor offering on the table. If you don't have a qualifier, you can't take that spot. So I was in the fall. Like needing a qualifier last minute. As fate would have it, I was actually over in China doing 100K in the Gobi Desert, and the best qualifier I had available to me at the time was the Kayamuka 100K, which just happened to be 6 days after this 100K in China. So I did the 100K in China, which, different story, different day, was like super miserable. It was like all beach sand basically for 100 kilometers. So it's like just constant one step forward or two steps forward, one step back. But I managed to make it back relatively conveniently enough to be at the race start for Kayamuka. Unfortunately for me, I got to like the highest point of the course and then started descending, and I clipped my foot on this rock, fell, hit my head on. So I should back up. When you fall, maybe you can relate. Like there's like a fall where there's like two different types of falls that I can relate to, where one is like it happens kind of slow motion. You know what's happening. There's nothing you can do about it, but you're just kind of like, oh man, I just screwed up.
Graceful
and you hit the
versus
ground and then
painful.
There's the falls though where you fall and you don't even realize you fell until you're on the ground. And this was one of those second ones, and it happened to be that I also hit my head on a rock. So I had this gash on my forehead, and I actually had to go back to the aid station and I ended up going to the emergency room and get a bunch of stitches and things like that. So long story short, I DNF'd from that qualifier. So I ended up then pivoting to Javelina as my last opportunity to actually get that qualifier for that. So I was like very much in a position where like Javelina was not the plan for the year that fall. It was a means to an ends. And I ended up having one of my better races at a 100-mile distance that year. But part of it was because I didn't go in there thinking, oh, I don't have my normal structure in place. I can't lean on crew and pacers today. I went in knowing, okay, this is just a race where I have to get to the finish line one way or the other, because that's going to meet goal one, which is the qualifier. And then if I have a good day on top of it, cool, that's bonus. So I went out there without a lot of pressure on myself, in my opinion, and just ran, and just recognized like pretty early on, like, okay, it's hot. I think they hit course record temps that year. I got like 102 degrees at the peak of the day. So I got in this rhythm where I get into the aid station. I'd have like, I can't remember what sports drink I was drinking for that race, but I'd fill up with that. I would grab some fruit, and that was kind of my plan A, plan B feeling wise. And then I would also do topical cooling every aid station that I could. And that was kind of my repetition. Javelina is great for this because the aid stations are pretty nicely spread out. So you just kind of like rinse and repeat. And then I ended up having a really good day there. And it wasn't because I was thoroughly planned for it, but it's because I accepted the circumstances for that particular situation. So there is that side of it too. But generally speaking, I think like you do want to be honest with yourself and kind of where your personality is. So if you're someone like yourself and you're like, I want to account for all this stuff, I think like having like, I like to like put together a spreadsheet in those situations and start kind of like itemizing things very early on. And ultimately what ends up happening is you make this massive spreadsheet that has way more than you would ever need. So then if you do it like early on, you can start kind of like, as you like work your way closer to the race, go through that spreadsheet, feel like, oh yeah, I really don't need this. This is ridiculous. And you sort of fine tune it. You just give yourself time. And then by the end, you have still a really structured like spreadsheet, but you've eliminated all the extra stuff that isn't technically needed. And what that ends up doing, I think a lot of times then, if you do have the opportunity to have a crew or a pacer, you've got a really, really nice document for them. And if they have a very clear document or a very clear understanding of what you're going to want and need, you've offloaded the responsibility of educating from that on the fly to where you come in the aid station. They're just like, it says she's going to want this, that, or that. So I know I've got 15 things here, but I'm just going to bring those 3 things out that she said she wants. And then when she comes in, she'll have walked through that, what she's going to want a kilometer, a mile out, and just grab what it is, and there's not a whole lot. You could, in theory, not even communicate with them if you wanted to, although it's probably nice to say that hi and thanks, but you can make it that simple, I think, if you have that sort of like structure built into it with that kind of a thing.
All of this stuff is like, oh yeah, of course, that makes sense. Like at Jacob's last 100 a couple weeks ago, I crewed him, and every single time
I gave her 1,000 pounds of stuff for her to carry to every aid station. She had a cart
and like pulling up these hills because we didn't know what Jacob was gonna want. And it was embarrassing because I look at all these other crew members and they have like a little baggie of stuff, and I have this wagon. So I'm like, maybe next time we got to dial that down so we know like what 3 things to bring.
And I think that spreadsheet idea actually is money for that. And create it, I love it. Create it at the beginning, and then
what else is useful for that too? So you have a situation like that, and I think this is just like this is also can be kind of a big thing to consider in general. Whereas when you finish a race, don't think of it as over. Think of it as like, okay, a lot of data just got presented to me. How do I take that and learn from it in a way where the next time I go forward, I eliminate the things that were suboptimal in there or negative in there. So for that situation, Jacob, like you could probably look at everything that you had brought out to you and think like, in hindsight, these are like the things that I definitely would want. These are the things I actually used. Maybe these are the things I didn't use, but I could totally see a reasonable reason for having them there, and I just lucked out and didn't need them that day. But here's you can usually find a good chunk of things where in hindsight you're like, yeah, that was ridiculous. Why did I need that 18th pair of socks? There's just no way I was going to need an 18th pair of socks. And you can make that card a little lighter.
Yeah.
So I don't make my pregnant wife haul around 1,000-pound carts.
And like what you said with the sheet, like make the spreadsheet early on and fine tune it over time. I feel like I've done that a lot subconsciously in like school, like making a plan for school or making just my work from home schedule and fine tuning it over time. Or like when I'm making my workout database, I feel like I write out all of these workouts and then I only end up using like 2 or 3 of all these workouts.
Yeah.
So that makes sense.
So Zach, just a couple more questions before we let you go. So everyone talks about knowing your why, like know your why. You got to know your why. When do you know if your why is powerful enough to get you through 100 miles, get you through that training plan and all that?
Yeah, this is an awesome question. I think like everyone's why is going to be somewhat unique. I think there's probably some that probably are a little more common or ones that pop up more often for whatever reason. But I think generally speaking, if your why is powerful enough to be a good why or a why that you can honestly walk away saying this is something that is actually worth my time. Because I think one thing you should be honest with yourself too is like ultra marathons are an experience, but they aren't necessarily something, they're definitely not something you have to do. There's a lot of other great things you could do outside of ultra marathoning. So like if you find, I'm not trying to talk people out of doing ultra marathons by any stretch of the imagination, but I think like if like people end up, I think feeling compelled oftentimes to do certain races for the sake of doing a race or certain training protocols for the sake of certain training protocols versus really putting together a process in which if you did go to the race and the race didn't play out the way you wanted to, in hindsight, can you look back at the whole process? So from the day you decided to start that plan to the second you finished that race, was that worth it? Was that worth the cost above replacement, in the sense that it was still something that bettered you versus what you were going to do otherwise, or something you found fulfillment from? And I think if you have a why that makes that the case, you're in the right position then, because then if you I mean, bad races they just happen sometimes. There's not always a great reason for it. So if you enjoy the way you're preparing for the race and what it brings to you on the day-to-day life, then it's a good why. So I think like your why should be something that's fulfilling in the short term and the long term, not just something where it's like, I've got this race I want to finish, and if I finish that race, then my life's going to be better, but everything along the way is going to be miserable. Those are unsustainable whys, in my opinion, or ones that don't oftentimes bear fruit the way you want them to, because then I think you find yourself in a position where you finish that race and then you recognize in the hindsight, oh, I didn't get the fulfillment I thought from that race finish. So that's the way I kind of look at it. I think, like, generally speaking, the more positives that you find with the entire process, regardless of the outcome, the more likely that why is something sustainable and meaningful to you, and one that you're not going to look at in hindsight down the road and be like, what was I thinking? Why did I do that?
Yeah.
That makes sense. So it's also important to just enjoy it. Enjoy what you're doing. It's not about just like mental toughness. We're going to push through every single workout. You need to enjoy bits and pieces of it, even if you don't enjoy it every single day, right?
You know what? That's actually a really good point, because one thing I've learned, the one that took me the longest to learn, was short intervals, where each one of these components to training, they have a positive to them that, if you recognize it, can really set you up to understand the benefit of it. And I think a lot of times we just don't recognize those. So maybe they happen, but we don't account for them. So then in our hindsight in the future, we don't necessarily see the value they provided. And like short intervals was this one for me, because like I never looked forward to them. And then when I would do them, I wouldn't associate how good I felt the rest of the day from executing something that I wasn't necessarily good at, or something that I didn't necessarily look forward to. And as soon as I realized that, like, sometimes just doing something that you don't like and getting through it and making it a positive experience for the circumstances puts you in a position to later on look at it, frame it in a way where, like, oh, I can do hard things that I don't necessarily always enjoy, and get gratification from being able to do that. And I think that's obviously a balance. I don't think you want to be like torturing yourself nonstop, but I think there's a balance in life of doing hard things that are maybe undesirable at times, in order to build up a tolerance and an ability to appreciate the things that you really do enjoy, and things like that too. So finding the why for even the least desirable parts of the process, I think it can be very helpful in really understanding if you're doing it for the right reasons. Because maybe you find a bunch of reasons not to do it, and then you realize like a lot of the other components you don't like either, and then you redirect to something different. I think with most people who are doing ultramarathons, I think have found a reason to be there, and it's more a question of what should they be doing within this sport. Should they be feeling compelled to do 100 miles versus a 50K, or a mountain race versus a timed event? And the bigger mistakes are trying to do a specific discipline within the sport versus the one that they're really going to enjoy at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I love that.
Process.
Apply that to drinking water.
Yeah.
I hate drinking water.
It's like, I don't like this, but I'm going to feel better this afternoon when I go running if I do it.
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly. Well, Zach, thank you so much for joining us. Just one last question here, and we asked every single one of our guests this question. What is your top piece of advice for someone who just signed up for their first 100-mile race?
Oh, this is a great question. The thing I would share the most is a little bit of a reflection of some of the stuff we talked about, but it would definitely be, if you can sit down and sort of take inventory of just like, what are the different pieces to this puzzle, and how can I break out small goals along the way? because the race itself is a very obvious goal, right? But the race itself might be quite a bit in the future. So this kind of has like the New Year's resolution vibe to it, where it's like on January 1st, you're like super motivated. I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to get jacked. And by the end of the year, it's going to be, I'm going to be a different person. Then by February, you're no longer a member of the gym. And that sort of thing, because that goal was so far off, the payoff was so far off. There weren't enough small wins along the way. So like you get the race is the big goal, but there's a bunch of little goals that are just kind of a little more disguised along the way. So sit down and figure out where those are. Maybe that is like, I like to look at them as like, you have like the big goal of the race, you've got kind of like more like almost like quarterly goals, then you have like monthly goals, weekly goals, and daily goals. If you can kind of break them into a similar category to that and account for a lot of that, then every time you check one of those off the list, you get a piece of gratification to kind of reaffirm in your mind why you're doing it and stay motivated. So if the only check off the list is the race at the end of the day, you're gonna wane in your motivation. But if you have at least one thing that you can get that gratification from checking off on a daily basis, some are gonna be more powerful than others, and that's fine, that's part of it. But having that kind of like that process will be rewarding. And it could be something as simple as like, all right, I did my first short interval session for the season. This is where I'm at now. The next piece of excitement is like, where am I going to be at once some of these adaptations take place? So then you're recognizing that improvement in that phase of the plan versus like just thinking about how fast it's going to make you at the race itself.
Yeah.
That's great. I feel like that's kind of along the lines of enjoy the journey and not just the destination.
Yeah. Well, Zach, thank you so much for joining us here on the pod. You have definitely told me everything I'm doing wrong and need to change, so I appreciate that.
Don't forget to account for the things you've done right, too, because that'll be the pod.
True that. I now know you can run 100 miles not doing a lot of it the wrong way, but it might just be very miserable. So, Zach, where can our listeners find you or follow you and see more of this content?
Sure. Yeah. So my kind of like central hub that has access to like everything I'm up to is my website, which is just zachbitter.com. From there, you can access my podcast, my coaching services, social media channels, all that sort of stuff. In terms of like social media, I'm probably most active on Instagram, which is just @ZachBitter.
Great. And for our listeners, are you currently taking clients right now?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome. And we'll put all that in the show notes.
Well, thank you, Zach. We appreciate your time and you coming on the podcast today.
No, absolutely. Thanks for the invite. It was fun chatting, and best of wishes for your upcoming races.
Hey guys, it's Melody here. Thank you so much for listening to Trail. It means so much to us. I'm really excited to tell you about my coaching business, where I help average Joes who are looking for a little bit more out of life do something big to find a little bit more purpose, direction, and meaning. Learn more on my Instagram @ThePineTreeRunner or on my website, melodybateman.biz. Links are in the show notes.